Not too long ago, we put out a video taking an exhaustive look at the Arrowhead, the wealthiest region of the core worlds, as the second in our series of videos examining the Star Wars galaxy in extreme depth. This video is another chapter in that series, and this time we're going to be looking at another part of the core, specifically the southern core, which consists of the southern parts of the core worlds and the colonies. The southern core is a bit of an eclectic region with a wide variety of fascinating cultures and a radically different history and development process to the other regions we've looked at so far. It was a region defined by forgotten cultures, strewn with the remnants of ancient empires, and in this video, we'll be taking an in-depth look at it. As always, the same ground rules for our tours of the Arrowhead and the Slice will apply for this video. We're not going to mention every single system in the southern core by name, though we did make a complete list during the making of this video. We will, however, at least mention all the interesting systems as well as trade routes, the relationships between various southern core civilizations, and also how the region fared during the Clone Wars. With that out of the way, let's get into things.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The southern core was a region spread across the core worlds and the colonies, bounded by the outer border of the colonies to the south, the Corellian run to the east, the edge of the deep core to the north, and the unknown regions to the west. A small strip of the southern deep core was actually also considered part of this region, as you can see on this map, but there wasn't really anything there, so we won't be getting into the deep core today. While the southern core was divided between the core worlds and the colonies, that border was really just a formality. There was no real difference in wealth, power, culture, or political prominence between your average southern core system in the core worlds and your average southern core system in the colonies. On the whole, the region was more suited to the colonies than the core, with the exception of a few sectors. It was wealthy, but not as obscenely wealthy as the Arrowhead. Apart from that broad description, the southern core was rather eclectic, described somewhat unhelpfully by the Essential Atlas as a polyglot region that resists easy characterization. There was some pretty staggering variety in the southern core, whether between incredibly rich and incredibly poor systems or between significantly different cultures. It had the densest concentration of allied regions, independent territories within what was otherwise Republic space, of any other part of the galaxy. And it was also a region with unique and fascinating history. In the Slice, the expansion of Republic civilization generally went from the core worlds toward the Outer Rim, incorporating different societies as it went. But in the southern core, Republic expansion happened in the core and colonies simultaneously, and it went from east to west, from the Arrowhead to the edge of the unknown regions. This expansion was also much slower than it was in the Slice, because during the first half of Republic history, there was actually another major galactic civilization in the southern core, the Herglic Trade Empire. The Herglic Trade Empire was one of the largest interstellar civilizations to emerge after the collapse of the Infinite Empire, and it actually predated the Republic by a few years. At the time the Republic was formed, the Herglic Trade Empire was an island civilization that didn't border any of the other post-Ricardan empires, allowing it to develop independently in its own unique way. Initially, it controlled a small blob of space in the southern core, mostly in the colonies, but as the Republic steadily expanded, the Herglic Trade Empire did as well. Very little is known about the Herglic Trade Empire. It was founded by the Herglics of Gidru, whom we'll talk about later, and it was presumably built on trade rather than military conquest, much like the Republic was. Some claim that the Herglic Trade Empire achieved a level of technological advancement that outstripped even the Galactic Empire, but it's unknown if this was true or just a myth. What is known is that the Republic and the Herglics eventually made contact with one another and enjoyed roughly 10,000 years of peaceful relations and trade. By the start of the Alsakan conflicts, the two civilizations had expanded until they shared a border, as you can see on the map that's on screen now. By that point, the Republic had long since started its expansion into the southern core, establishing colonies that were mostly dominated by the Corellians, but their path of expansion became blocked when they ran up against the Herglic's borders. As a result, the Herglic Trade Empire was the faction responsible for exploring and developing much of the southern core, not the Republic. But around 15,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Herglic trade empire began to collapse, beginning with a conflict of some sort known as the Herglic Crush. This ended with the shattered remnants of the Herglic trade empire ultimately joining the Republic in 13,000 BBY, bringing an end to roughly 12,000 years of Herglic rule in the region. The Herglic trade empire was quickly integrated into the Republic, and by the time of the Clone Wars, it had been assimilated to the point that the Herglic's legacy was only visible to those who knew where to look. But the Herglics left their mark on the region all the same. They were the ones who charted the key hyperspace routes through the southern core, and many planets in the region had originally been built up by the Trade Empire. For many thousands of years, former Herglic space was the western edge of Republic territory in the southern core. It wasn't until after the Great Hyperspace War that the Republic began to expand further into the region, ultimately completing its explorations of the southern core by 3000 BBY. By the time of the Clone Wars, with the exception of its western fringe, the southern core was pretty thoroughly explored. The eastern half of the region was also very well settled, similar in population density to the inner portions of the slice, while the western half was much more thinly settled, with large empty regions that contained very few colonies. Before we get into discussing the systems of the southern core, we need to quickly discuss the hyperspace routes of this region. Alongside the Corellian Run, which formed the southern core's eastern border, two of the galaxy's most important hyperspace routes ran through the southern core: the Corellian Trade Spine, which ran southwest from Corellia out into the inner rim, and the Rimmer Trade Route, which started at Abrogado Ray in the southern core before striking out due south. The Trade Spine was the Republic's primary avenue of expansion into the region, while the Rimmer had originally been the backbone of the Herglic Trade Empire, originally known as the Hidakai Pool. The Hidakai Pool had once extended further coreward to Daupherm, but the modern Rimmer only went out to Abrogado Ray. Other key southern core routes included the Tapani bypass, a branch of the Rimmer trade route that broke off from the main route at Thyfera in the inner rim and rejoined it at Abrogado Ray, the Shipwright's Trace, which ran from Fondor out to Foles and beyond, and the Giju Run, the main route into the west and southern core, which ran along the border of the core and colonies from Giju to Atricia. Now, we're at last going to start looking at the sectors and systems of the southern core, beginning in the east and heading west. We'll begin with the easternmost part, the region of the southern core that stretched along the Corellian Trade Spine. This was where part of the earliest phase of Republic expansion occurred, and as a result, this region was densely populated and thoroughly integrated into Republic society. It was dominated by the Corellians, the Duros, and the Deveronians, all of whom had played a major role in exploring the region and pushing the Republic's frontier even further outward. The Corellians were the most influential power in the region, a legacy of the ancient Corellian hegemony, but the Duros had a major role in regional trade, while the Deveronians also had their share of political power. Let's start with a quick recap of a sector we talked about in the Arrowhead video, the Corellian sector, which was divided between the Arrowhead and the southern core. Many of the most prominent Corellian sector worlds, including Corellia itself, were in the Arrowhead, but the Corellians actually had greater influence in the southern core, as the initial wave of Republic settlement in the region was Corellian-backed. During the Alcican conflicts, the eastern southern core usually joined the Corellian hegemony, and even in the modern era, many systems in the region still followed the Corellians' lead. The Corellian sector contained the junction of the two galaxies' major hyperspace routes, the Corellian Run, which ran past Corellia and Nubia on its way out of the core worlds, and the Corellian Trade Spine, which struck out from Corellia into the southern core. The Trade Spine was once a branch of the Corellian Run that headed out toward the Herglic Trade Empire, but over the millennia, it slowly expanded into a major route in its own right, linking the core worlds with the remote western reaches. We're going to start by following the Trade Spine on its way through the southern core, and since we already discussed all the systems in the Corellian sector when talking about the Arrowhead, we're going to move on down the Trade Spine to the next sector over. After leaving Corellia, the Corellian Trade Spine passed Plimpto and New Plimpto before entering another of the southern core's most important sectors, the Duro sector. The Duro sector was a small pocket of space around Duro itself, a core founder of the Republic and one of the most important core worlds. Duro was the homeworld of the Duros, one of the galaxy's most prolific non-human species, a people known for their love of space travel, exploration, and trade, as well as for being co-inventors of the modern hyperdrive. Culturally, the Duro sector was really an extension of the Arrowhead, and during the Alsacan conflict, it had even been loyal to Coruscant over Corellia, as the Duros were Coruscant's main backer during that period. During the Republic's early history, Duro controlled trade and diplomacy between the Republic and the Herglic trade empire, and it was heavily involved in Republic colonization efforts in both the Slice and the Southern Core. Originally a vibrant jungle world, Duro was transformed into a polluted, toxic wasteland by millennia of unregulated industrial activity, as well as Mandalorian and Separatist bombardments. The surface was abandoned millennia before the Clone Wars, with a population of only 12,000 left to tend automated factories and food production facilities, while the majority of the Duros relocated to a collection of 20 orbiting space cities, which had a combined population of 1.6 billion. Despite this, Duro remained incredibly wealthy and politically powerful, thanks in part to its continued industrial output and the numerous shipyards scattered throughout the Duro system, which gave Duro a shipbuilding industry that rivaled Corellia's. Duro once had a hereditary monarchy, but it was eventually replaced by a merchant council, which represented the planet's most important business interests. During the time of the Republic, Duro had considerable geopolitical power, since it essentially controlled trade on the Corellian trade spine, and it was a major military stronghold to boot, guarding the Arrowhead against the Salts from the south in several wars. During the time of the Empire, though, Duro lost a little of its prestige. The Duros were powerful enough that the Empire couldn't completely disenfranchise them, but it did strip Duro of much of its political power by incorporating the Duro sector into the Corellian sector. Past Duro, the Corellian trade spine passed the Corellian-aligned planet Chassin and Conjula, the home of the Grand Astrocartographic Institute. Before leaving the core, it passed Gandiel, a major trade world and military stronghold that shipped raw materials in bulk to the shipyards of Duro, Corellia, and Fondor. There were a few other resource worlds adjacent to this stretch of the trade spine, including Chum, as well as quite a few wealthy planets worthy of their place in the core worlds. These included Dantil, the capital of the Emo sector, its sector neighbor Bethars, the notably corrupt banking planet Sestria in the Testar sector, and Hemi 4, a wealthy industrial system home to the Bakur Mining Corporation, which colonized the remote planet Bakura a century before the Clone Wars. Hemi 4 was also the birthplace of the religion known as the Cosmic Balance, which eventually died out on Hemi 4 but survived on Bakura. One of the planets of the Andaran system, Andara, was also wealthy, industrialized, and powerful, and it had outsized political influence due to hosting the Leadership School, an institution that trained the children of the galaxy's elites to take power one day. The Andaran system's other inhabited planet, Ieria, was slightly less well off and much less prestigious, even though it maintained similar levels of industrial production, and it resented the fact that the Andarans alone represented the system in the Senate. Also in this region was Maltora, the homeworld of the stocky, oddly jointed Maltoran species, and Kavos II in the Pamarak sector, the birthplace of the Matukai. The Matukai were a sect of Force users founded not long after the Great Sith War, when a woman on Kavos II discovered that she was Force sensitive while practicing martial arts. She developed her own unique Force philosophy based around martial arts, which she passed down to a small group of disciples who spread across the galaxy. Matukai philosophy was light-sided, and the Matukai were on good terms with the Jedi, but their way differed from the way of the Jedi in that it emphasized the importance of the physical body above all. The Matukai taught that the Force was best channeled through the body via martial arts and exercise, which they viewed as forms of meditation. The Matukai were able to use the Force to significantly enhance their agility, strength, and durability, making them highly effective combatants. Down in the colonies, the Corellian trade spine passed Belazura, or one of the most beautiful planets in the galaxy. Belazura was a wealthy trade world with a prominent spaceport, home to Belazura sensor technologies, but it was best known for its picturesque countryside, which was dominated by mountains and grasslands. Past Belazura, the trade spine continued down Briex in the Varvena sector, Eniska, and lastly Kalada in the Dulua sector. Located in the Unarid cluster subsector, Kalada was an industrial world, though it retained a few unspoiled regions of savanna and forests. It primarily produced repulsor lifts and speeders for a variety of companies, including Arakid Industries, and it was also a major smuggler's haunt. Kalada was a pretty prominent world, but it played second fiddle to the capital of the Dulua sector, Deveron, which lay just off the Corellian trade spine on the edge of the inner rim. Deveron was a mountainous jungle world known for its vicious predators and its native sentience, the Deveronians. The Deveronians were a tough, matriarchal species known for their strong sexual dimorphism and gender roles. The males were horned, red-skinned wanderers known for their aggression, cunning, and physical resemblance to demons, while the females were furry, even-tempered administrators, more intelligent than their male counterparts. The Deveronians were an early spacefaring race, thanks to the females' scientific and technological advancements and the males' urge to explore the stars, and they had already spent millennia exploring their region of space when they made contact with the Republic during the first few centuries of its history. Deveronian scouts played a major role in the blazing of the Corellian trade spine, as well as Republic exploratory efforts in the southern core and western reaches, and Deveronian traders gave Deveron a privileged position in Republic politics. The Deveronians were also noted for their higher than average rate of force sensitivity, which led to the Jedi establishing a satellite academy on Deveron, the Temple of Edith. Past the Dulua sector, the Corellian trade spine ran to Foles, which sat at the crucial Foles crossroads, the junction between the Corellian trade spine and the shipwright's trace. Located right on the border between the colonies and the Inner Rim, Foles was a wealthy trading hub, home to a large and well-stocked spaceport. Due to its control of the Foles crossroads, Foles was an important stop for ships hauling raw materials from the resource worlds of the trade spine to Fondor at the end of the shipwright's trace, and it was one of the most strategically important worlds in the southern core as a consequence. Past Foles, the Corellian trade spine plunged into the Inner Rim. Between the Corellian trade spine and the Corellian run, there were a number of other noteworthy systems, many of them under strong Corellian influence. A large chunk of this triangle of space, the region between Motex and Arat Fraka, was taken up by the Black Nebula, which was completely impassable due to the effects of a pair of high-mass neutron stars. The innermost depths of the Black Nebula were thus inaccessible, but its outskirts were home to a number of hidden space stations, home to black market starship outfitters. Rimward of the Black Nebula was the planet Frostwythe, a planet of ranches and pastures that exported meat, leather, and other animal-based textiles, as well as Darep, which lay near the Foles crossroads. On the other side of the trade spine were a handful of other significant worlds, which lay close to the ancient border between the Republic and the Herglic trade empire. These included the gas giant Sanjin, which had habitable moons that housed refugee camps during the Clone Wars, and the planet Videl, the homeworld of the gold-skin Videllan species. There was also Foros, the homeworld of the Forosians, and the smaller, more primitive Ru. Foros's two species had highly complex cultures, and the Forosians built many grand cities and temples, but most of these were destroyed during the Clone Wars, which saw Foros devastated by a protracted siege. In the core worlds just west of the Corellian trade spine and its neighbors, there was another patch of Republic settlements wrapping around the deep core, out to what were once the borders of the Herglic trade empire. For many long millennia, these systems were part of the Republic's frontier, and though this had since ceased to be the case by the Clone Wars, many of these systems remained relatively neglected, especially by the standards of the core. The best example of this was Balosar, the homeworld of a near-human species of the same name. Balosar was an industrial planet home to strong corporate interests that had long ago gained near total control of the planet's corrupt government, which they used to all but eliminate environmental protections on the planet. This, combined with the low wage companies were allowed to pay Belosar workers, attracted corporations from all across the core to the planet. Before long, Belosar was industrialized from pole to pole, so overbuilt with factory blocks and city districts that sunlight was unable to reach the planet's surface. Thanks to the lack of environmental regulations, Belosar's atmosphere was completely destroyed, so thoroughly polluted that it was just barely breathable, and the Belosars had to adapt to be mostly immune to the toxins in order to survive as a species. The corporate executives that ruled over Belosar reaped immense profits from this, but the vast majority of Belosars were trapped in crippling poverty, treated little better than slaves on their own homeworld. When Belosar's economy stalled due to the founding of new, more efficient mech worlds in other parts of the Republic, the corporate government simply made up the difference by cutting education and other social services, destroying Belosar society even further, and many Belosars were forced to turn to crime to survive. Things got even worse for Belosar when it was discovered that the native Belo mushrooms, which grew in caves deep beneath the planet's poisoned surface, contained a chemical that could be used in the production of a powerful narcotic: death sticks. To revitalize the planet's failing economy, Belosar's government converted many of the planet's factories to begin producing death sticks, which it exported en masse to the Galactic narcotics market. This new industry improved the profits of the corporate executives who ran Belosar, but it destroyed Belosar society even further as the highly addictive hallucinogens began to spread rapidly across the planet. Belosar's immunity to toxins meant that they weren't affected by most of the side effects of death stick abuse, but they could still get addicted, driving them to crime and thus cutting their lives short in other ways. As a result, by the time of the Clone Wars, Belosar wasn't just one big polluted, barely habitable, poverty-stricken drug lab, but also one of the most crime-ridden planets in the galaxy, rivaling even Nar Shaddaa. Its people lived in desperate poverty and amidst rampant crime, and their only relief from their hellish lives was death stick abuse, which Belosar became known across the galaxy. Many Belosars fled their homeworld to escape this life, but even those who managed to escape often got caught up in the death stick trade, giving their whole species a reputation as criminals and addicts. Fortunately, not every species in this part of the southern core fared as poorly as the Belosars. The humanoid Gamma Sen of the planet Gamma seemingly fared better, for one. And most of the worlds in this region were certainly more pleasant than Belosar, particularly the resort worlds Gyosha and Shulshi, the latter of which was especially famed for its beautiful beaches. Asbrian was a moderately successful agricultural world, while Thomork, on the edge of the deep core, hosted military shipyards, which the Empire later used to produce star destroyers. But what this part of the southern core really had in spades was ancient ruins. The planet Faunte was once home to a long extinct species of whom only ruins and old records remained, while the jungle planet Olictuz hosted the ancient Es-Raza Temple. Early Republic scouts claimed this site was built atop a mystical, reality-warping nexus that granted those who stepped into it powers of far-seeing and teleportation, earning this obscure temple a legendary reputation and a place on the historian Facendi's list of the 20 wonders of the galaxy. By the time of the Clone Wars, however, the Es-Raza Temple lay in ruins, and scientists had determined that the site's reality-warping powers came from the fact that it was built atop a cavern of Lumni spice. Then there was the most enigmatic ruin of all, the Diatian Clockwork. Built around the star Diatia Major, a star on the edge of the deep core with no planetary system, the Diatian Clockwork was an enormous metal ring that encircled the entire star, its surface etched with irregular grooves. The purpose of this enigmatic artifact is unknown, but it was widely believed to have been a celestial construct. Also along the edge of the deep core was the former northern frontier of the Herglic trade empire, centered around the original final stretch of the Hidakai Pool. The Herglics had long ago lost control of this region of space, and they had little remaining influence there, especially after parts of this periphery were carved out into two allied regions in their own right, the Daupherm Planet States and the Botor Enclave. The Daupherm Planet States was an alliance of just over 30 star systems ruled by the Daupherm, a culture of humans from the planet Daupherm. The Botor Enclave, meanwhile, was a coalition of around 24 star systems, all located in the outer fringes of a nebula, most of which were settled by the Botori of Botor, a bear-like humanoid species. Neither of these allied regions was especially prominent. On the contrary, they were considered backwaters by core world standards, and Republic colonization efforts and most respectable trade consistently gave both of them a wide berth. There was a simple reason for that. The main cultural trait of both of these civilizations was that they absolutely despised each other. It isn't known what this feud was about or how exactly it started. In ancient times, both Botor and Daupherm were members of the Herglic trade empire, linked to one another and the Abrogado system by the Hidakai Pool, which originally started at Daupherm. We suspect that the Botori and Daupherm turned against one another during the collapse of the Herglic trade empire, and at any rate, the two peoples definitely hated each other by the time the Herglics became part of the Republic. The Botori and Daupherm carved out their own small territories during the Empire's fall, and around the time the Herglics joined the Republic, they both decided to become allied regions to maintain semi-independent status. Since joining the Republic as allied regions, the Botor Enclave and the Daupherm planet states fought no less than 40 wars against one another, some of which lasted for centuries. The most recent, which was ongoing during the Clone Wars, had been raging for 500 years. These wars had been going on for long enough that both the Republic and the two allied regions themselves had protocol for dealing with them. The Daupherm and Botori had agreed to codes of wartime conduct, part law and part tradition, which governed any sort of conflict between the two states, from petty vendettas to total war, while the Republic had adopted a policy of ignoring Daupherm-Botori wars unless they spread beyond the allied regions. The Empire continued this policy, not wishing to waste its resources in trying to get the Botori and Daupherm to behave. Beyond that, we don't know all that many details about either of these allied regions. Of the 30-odd member systems of the Daupherm planet states, we only know about Daupherm itself, and even then, we only know that it was the regional capital and home to a large human population. The Daupherm are known to have maintained a merchant fleet, which means that they had at least some trade with the Republic, and they also had a large military which consisted of the Daupherm Systems Fleet and the Daupherm Marine Corps. The military hardware of the Daupherm planet states was obsolete by Galactic standards, with fleets consisting mostly of small, fast-moving corvettes, but since they only ever fought the Botori, who had a similar level of military technology, this wasn't much of a concern. Even less is known about the Botor Enclave. Most of this allied region seemingly consisted of the nebula that the worlds of the Enclave were nestled in, which included Botor, the homeworld of the Botori and the capital of the Botor Enclave, and Kerensik, a frozen planet home to a population of humans aligned with the Botori. Like the Daupherm planet states, the Botor Enclave was likely heavily militarized, as would be necessary for its constant wars. Moving rimward, let's next take a look at the heart of the ancient Herglic trade empire, the systems at the head of the Rimmer trade route, formerly the Hidakai Pool. Herglic influence still lingered in some places here, and Herglic merchants still had a strong influence on trade in the region, but since the region joined the Republic, a number of other civilizations became prominent as well, exerting influence over their neighbors and the rest of the Rimmer trade route. Most prominently, this included the humans of the Tapani sector, longtime partners of the Herglics, who, by the time of the Clone Wars, had become even more wealthy, politically powerful, and influential than the Herglics themselves. 3 species from further down the Rimmer, the Given, the Bith, and the Celestins, had influence in this region as well. Adjacent to the Rimmer trade route itself were a number of systems with their own proud civilizations that had once been Herglic subjects before becoming part of the Republic. To the west of the route was Stelios, a minor trade world whose spaceports had notoriously lax regulations, making it an ideal stop for smugglers. Among other worlds, Stelios traded with nearby Yav, a warm planet of jungles, oceans, and beaches ruled by an aristocracy, the highest of 20 castes that made up Yav's society. Nearby was the Belgoroth system, a binary star that contained the planet Belgoroth itself. Considered by some to be a remote world due to its location west of the Rimmer, Belgoroth was a rugged, mountainous world with a small population, home only to a small spaceport and a minor orbital dockyard. It had a few factories and large, unregulated scrapyards on its surface, as well as a Zerka arms plant that, during the Clone Wars, secretly made illegal chemical weapons for the CIS. On the east side of the Rimmer, there was Iphigene, the homeworld of the craggy-faced Iphigenie, and a major regional trade world, and Frago, a wealthy urban planet that had been run by the Cobral crime family until a few decades before the Clone Wars. Nearby Plexus was home to the headquarters of House Nouvelis, a chapter of the Bounty Hunters Guild that was known for only taking especially high-paying bounties. Also located in this region was Weldy 3, a semi-obscure mining world that likely shipped raw materials to the shipyards of Fondor. There was also the Ashori Confederan, a sector-sized local power based on Isht, the homeworld of the Ashori. The Ashori were a humanoid species with horn-tipped fists known for their belligerence and long rivalry with the neighboring Diamala, a calm, leathery-skinned and prosperous species. The two routinely got into disputes over trade and resource distribution, which the Iphigenie attempted to mediate on at least one occasion. The Diamala homeworld, Diamal, was situated on a branch of the Rimmer trade route. The Rimmer began in the core worlds at the Abrogado system, which you might remember from Star Wars The Clone Wars. It contained 5 planets, but of these, only Abrogado Array was actually habitable. This sleepy, mostly rural world was one of the most fascinating planets in the core worlds, especially since it was entirely unsuited to the core. In most respects, it more closely resembled your average Outer Rim world, despite being the coreward endpoint of one of the most important hyperspace routes in the galaxy. Abrogado Array was a pleasant, temperate world, the homeworld of the small, semi-sentient moochers and the lanky, fully sentient Gardos, a tolerant, friendly species that formed a mixed society with non-native colonists, primarily humans and Herglics. Abrogado Array had a population of just 40 million, much of which lived in a scattering of modest spaceport cities. Abrogado Array had once been part of the Herglic trade empire, and it still exhibited signs of Herglic influence. Despite this long history, however, Abrogado Array was still a somewhat undeveloped world by core standards. This wasn't for lack of resources. Indeed, Abrogado Array was one of the few planets in the galaxy where electrum was found in relative abundance. Rather, Abrogado Array just seems to have been overlooked by history, ignored until the native Gados adopted Republic technology and built their first spaceports. Despite the small size of these spaceports, Abrogado Array was an extremely important trade world due to its location at the head of the Rimmer trade route, which kept its ports constantly busy. The spaceports of Abrogado Array were generally considered safe, but they were also highly unregulated, which made them a veritable smuggler's paradise. Thus, Abrogado Array was one of the most infamous shadow ports in the core, a key hub of spice smuggling on the Rimmer. From Abrogado Array, the Rimmer trade route struck off into the Rim. As we've already mentioned, this route had its origins in the ancient backbone of the Herglic trade empire, the Hidakai Pool, which originally stretched from Daupherm to Yagdul in the Outer Rim. Millennia after the Herglics joined the Republic, they worked together with the Given and Celestins to extend the Hidakai Pool into the modern Rimmer trade route, which was completed in 5500 BBY. A few millennia later, a spur of the Rimmer trade route opened up between Thyfera in the Inner Rim and Abrogado Array in the core, the Tapani bypass. This route ran parallel to the Rimmer to the east, and it was originally meant to allow Bacta to be shipped to the core more efficiently. However, most trade along that stretch of the Rimmer quickly shifted to the bypass since this route passed through the wealthy Tapani sector. As a result, those systems along the portions of the Rimmer this route bypassed saw a bit of a decline in trade, including the worlds of Herglic space. Along its coreward leg, the Tapani bypass passed by Diamal, which we discussed earlier, as well as the Bith system, which was considered strategically important during the Clone Wars. Despite its name, the Bith system did not contain the homeworld of the Bith species, who were from Clactor 7 on the outer rim end of the Rimmer. It did, however, contain a Bith colony. The Rimmer trade route proper, meanwhile, passed by the Dental and Rimmer systems. Dental was a well-off trade world run by the House of Dental, and the planet became notorious during the Galactic Civil War after the Empire carried out a genocide of the planet's population by unleashing an airborne strain of the Kandorian Plague, also known as the Blue Shadow Virus. Finally, the planet Rimmer, which gave the Rimmer trade route its name, was another trade world home to a number of ancient ruins and artifacts, possibly relics of the Herglic trade empire. Down in the colonies, the Rimmer trade route and Tapani bypass moved on into the densely populated and economically powerful heart of the southern core. On the western side, the Rimmer trade route passed through Herglic space, a small pocket of territory that was all that remained of the Herglic's ancient empire. This region was small, containing just 40 inhabited star systems, most of them on or closely adjacent to the Rimmer. Herglic space was considered an allied region, so the Herglics were still semi-independent, but their ancient empire was long gone, reduced to just its original core. The most important world in Herglic space was the Herglic homeworld, Giju, which sat at the junction of the Rimmer trade route, the Giju Run and the Giju Passage, the latter being a spur of the Giju Run that led off to the Tapani sector. Giju was a mostly aquatic world dotted with polar ice sheets and marshy islands, the latter of which were heavily urbanized, covered with industrial plants and large, high-class spaceports. It was a clean, modern, and largely pleasant world, wealthy thanks to both its imperial heritage and its prominent role in local manufacturing and trade. Its indigenous sentience, the Herglics, were cetaceans, essentially humanoid whale people. They were pretty massive as far as humanoids went, which many of them were self-conscious about, and they were also known for being quite tough. As cetaceans, they breathed through blowholes on the tops of their heads, and their skin was often smooth and shiny. Herglics were generally easygoing and loved exploration, meeting new people, and gambling, and they were spread far and wide across the stars, especially along the Rimmer trade route. Most were peaceful, but as with any species, there were exceptions to this rule, including the infamous pirate captain Barkuda, who was notorious for eating his prisoners alive. Apart from Giju itself, Herglic space contained a number of prominent Herglic-dominated trade worlds, manufacturing centers, and colonies, including the planet Kuda. Together, these worlds made Herglic space wealthy and politically powerful. The Herglics not only had significant influence over trade along the Inner Rimmer, but they also controlled access to the Giju Run, and their robust manufacturing base made them prominent producers of high technology. The legacy of the Herglic trade empire helped as well, and all told, these factors made the Herglics the most influential non-human civilization in the southern core. Past Herglic space, the Rimmer passed through the CERN sector, which contained the planets Cleo, Abradon, the icy world CERN Prime, and Gorman, a planet that, after the rise of the Empire, would be the site of the infamous Gorman massacre. Just off the Rimmer itself was Luctine, a planetoid that housed the pirate base Luctine Depot, as well as Flubet, home of the avian Flubetans, and Traylon II, the headquarters of Zygian Savings and Loan. There was also Ophideron, a desert planet home to the Serpent Masters, a group of bandits that tamed and rode local species of flying serpents. East of the Rimmer, the Tapani bypass passed Vindalia, the homeworld of the humanoid Vulpine Vindalians, before plunging into the Tapani sector, the most complex part of the entire southern core. The Tapani sector was a sprawling, densely populated tract of space with a long and highly complex history. Originally, the Tapani sector was one of the early core territories of the Herglic trade empire, but the Herglics lost control of it before joining the Republic. By the time it became a Republic territory circa 13,000 BBY, the Tapani sector was mostly empty and it attracted large numbers of human settlers from the Arrowhead. Originally governed by the Pella Compact, the settlers of the Tapani sector discovered and occupied a vast knot of habitable worlds, many of them rich in natural resources. They established relations with the Herglics, trading with Herglic space and incorporating elements of Herglic culture into their own, and they blazed trade routes that connected their region with Giju and with the rest of the Republic. In the early days of the Tapani sector, the region lay on the Republic frontier, and its settlers were largely left to their own devices. In isolation, they multiplied, divided themselves up into clans, and ultimately fought a series of civil wars with one another, which consolidated the Tapani sector under the rule of 12 kingdoms. The ensuing period was known as the 12 Kingdoms era, and it lasted from 11,708 BBY to 7,348 BBY. During this time, the 12 kingdoms routinely squabbled with one another, and they also expanded their territory onto what would later become the Shapani bypass, establishing the Free World's territory as a buffer between their kingdoms and Herglic space. In 7,348 BBY, the 12 Kingdoms era came to an end when Tapani, a noble of House Melantha, began a 20-year unification war that forged the 12 kingdoms together into the Tapani Empire. When all was said and done, Tapani was crowned emperor and the sector's dynastic period began. Despite its name, the Tapani Empire wasn't all that imperialistic, and the Tapani sector didn't really expand during its reign. Over the course of the next 5,000 years, the Tapani Empire largely enjoyed stability under the reigns of 16 dynasties and emperors. The only major period of instability before the end of the period happened during the Old Sith Wars, when the House Meseti-aligned Mekrosa Order began causing some trouble. After its founding in 4200 BBY, the Mekrosa Order became a Sith cult, and during the Great Sith War, it became a key component of Exar Kun's Sith Confederation. After the end of the Great Sith War, a civil war known to history as the Cleansing of the Nine Houses began, which saw the Republic and the Jedi Order intervene on the side of House Pelagia to crush the Mekrosa Order. The Mekrosa Order went into hiding and survived, but the Jedi were successful in wiping out all its Sith members. The Tapani sector aligned with the Sith again during the Jedi Civil War, but this was for secular political reasons, and the Mekrosa Order would ultimately fade into obscurity, losing all of its former power. After about 5,000 years, the Tapani Empire entered a protracted period of decline, and the dynastic era ultimately ended in 1582 BBY during the New Sith Wars, when the royal family was overthrown in a military coup. The generals who oversaw this coup then handed power over to a coalition of reformers who kept the sector united under a federal system. The blazing of the Shapani bypass, which passed through the Tapani sector, brought new wealth and trade to the region, and by the time of the Clone Wars, the Tapani sector was still prosperous and united under the old federal system. Its abundant natural resources and thriving mining sector made the Tapani sector an economic powerhouse worthy of the core worlds, and its population was generally educated and relatively affluent. Despite the reformation of the sector's government into a federal system, the Tapani sector's population was still divided between a noble and commoner class, and it was still controlled by noble houses. The mostly human nobles of the Tapani sector were powerful local hegemons in the central southern core, but their power was dispersed between the 7 ruling houses. Originally, there were 12 houses in the Tapani sector, but 3 ceased to exist during the Unification War, and 2 more were absorbed by rivals during the Cleansing of the 9 Houses. The survivors were House Pelagia, House Meseti, House Kadrian, House Barnaba, House Rena, House Melantha, and House Calypsa. They presided over a stratified and highly traditionalist society, human-dominated but accepting of aliens, one with a low tolerance for dissent and a strong sense of honor and propriety. While the Tapani sector was a full member of the Republic rather than an allied region, it viewed its relationship with the Republic as a simple business arrangement more than anything, and its nobles tended to look down on the rest of galactic civilization. The Tapani sector contains 70 inhabited star systems, including around 14 heavily populated systems, as well as a number of other minor outposts and uninhabited systems. It was a relatively young region of space, home to lots of nebulae, newly formed star systems, and debris, which made many of the hyperspace routes through the region somewhat unstable. However, the planets of this sector were also very metal rich, making them excellent for mining of all sorts. The region's young age also meant that it had very few indigenous sentient species. The Tapani sector was divided into two sub-regions known locally as the Expanse and the Free Worlds. The Expanse was the main portion of the Tapani sector, ruled directly by the noble houses, each of which controlled one of 7 provinces. The Free Worlds, meanwhile, were once a region of backwater colonies, but the blazing of the Tapani bypass transformed them into a series of wealthy trade worlds as the new branch of the Rimmer passed through the Free Worlds. While the Tapani noble houses had a strong presence in the Free Worlds, the territory was instead governed by the League of Tapani Free Worlds, an elected government that maintained a limited independence from the rest of the Tapani sector. Let's take a look at the Free Worlds first. The Free Worlds territory lay directly along the Tapani bypass, which at one point passed through a string of large, vibrant nebulae which made up the core of the Free Worlds. Apart from the Tapani bypass itself, the major routes in the Free Worlds were the Giju Passage, the spur of the Giju Run that connected the Tapani bypass to the main Rimmer trade route, the Procopian shipping lane, which led into the heart of the cluster, a branch of the shipping lane, the 3 Ellis Run, and the Shipwright's Trace, which ran from Fondor out to the Tapani sector toward the Corellian trade spine. The Tapani bypass entered the Free Worlds at Aileron, a rugged, smog-choked planet with a crust rich in valuable metals. It was a major mining world and droid manufacturer, home to the headquarters of the Makunda Heavy Ores, the Lin Corporation, and the Aileron Trade Cooperative, making it a wealthy and commercially vital member of the Free Worlds. Aileron was one of many mining worlds in the Free Worlds. Another set of prominent ones was the 3 Ellas, the planets Sorella, Dorella, and Pernella, which lay along the 3 Ellas route. These planets were all noteworthy ore mining worlds, and they were also known for their lax governments, which made all 3 systems havens for smuggling in the Tapani sector. Dorella, the most prominent of the 3, was also heavily populated and urbanized. The 3 Ellas weren't the only smugglers' havens in the Free Worlds either. Yape and the industrial world Sheva were similar cases. Past Aileron, the Tapani bypass proceeded to Talan, one of the most important free worlds which sat at the junction between the bypass, the Giju Passage, and the Procopian shipping lane. One of the most prominent and populous planets in the free world, Talan was heavily urbanized and had a massive population, totaling 67 billion people. This included large numbers of Murlisi and especially Herglics, who had their own enclaves in Talan's enormous cities. Talan was a major trade world, overseeing back-to shipments across the Tapani bypass and trade between the Tapani sector and Herglic space. It was the Tapani sector's primary link to the greater galaxy and the biggest trading world in the whole sector. Talan was also a notable shipyard world, importing ore from Aileron, Neona, and the 3 Ellas for the use of the Tapani Starship Cooperative and other shipbuilders. Importing ore from Aileron, Neona, and the 3 Ellas for use of the Tapani Starship Cooperative and other shipbuilders. During the Clone Wars, all of these factors, plus its strategically valuable location, made Talan into a major Republic military stronghold. From Talan, the Procopian shipping lane struck off into the main Tapani sector, passing the waterworld Neona as it did. Neona had been completely flooded in an ancient catastrophe that wiped out the indigenous Neonan civilization, leaving only ancient ruins on the sea floor. Neona's sunken crust was also rich in metals, which were mined by Hansen Mining Consolidated, which built a series of floating cities on the surface of the planet's oceans to support its workers in undersea mining operations. Neona, like the other mining planets in the free worlds, shipped ore to the Tapani sector's shipyard worlds, as well as to the other systems outside of the sector. After Talan, the Tapani bypass passed a number of other key free worlds, most notably Lamor 4, Merlist, and Fondor. Lamur IV was a former Herglic colony with a large Herglic population, the annual site of the Priol Dana Festival, while Mullust was a humid world home to the diminutive avian Mullusi species, renowned for their scholars and scientists. Mullust was dominated by swamps and forests and had lighter than average gravity. It was orbited by a thick ring system of metal-rich rocks, which was sometimes mined for use in Fondor's shipyards. Mullust was one of the most democratic worlds in the Tapani sector, and it had some of the best universities in the southern core, including the renowned Mullust Trade and Science Academy. Mullust was very prominent among the worlds of the Tapani sector, but it had very little outside influence, as the Mullusi were generally insular and unconcerned with geopolitical power. Perhaps the most important world in the entire Tapani sector was Fondor, one of the galaxy's primary shipyard worlds, lying at the junction of the Shapani Bypass and the Shipwright's Trace. The Fondor system contained 4 asteroid belts, which were extensively mined for raw materials, as well as the habitable moon Nalastia. But the heart of the system was Fondor itself, an ecomonopolis orbited by a ring of shipyards and orbital spaceports. Apart from a few minor tracts of desert and wasteland, Fondor was completely covered by industrial sprawl, a collection of vast factories, strip mines, and worker barracks, dotted with corporate office blocks and the occasional city district. Despite its heavy industrialization, Fondor had a surprisingly small population of just 5 billion, as most of its industrial facilities were automated. Most of this organic population was Fondorian, belonging to a hairless, near-human species descended from Tapani human colonists. Fondor's people were organized into castes, with the lower worker castes treated very poorly and kept in slum-like barracks. As a result of this, though Fondor was a wealthy planet on paper, most of its people were desperately poor. To make matters worse for the ordinary Fondorians, Fondor's cities were also notoriously crime-ridden, and the Basadi huts had a strong presence on the planet. Fondor took in vast amounts of raw materials from its surface strip mines, its asteroid belts, and from mining planets all over the southern core, which it transformed into droids, other forms of high technology, and most importantly, starship components, which were assembled into completed vessels at the orbiting Fondor shipyards. These were among the most productive shipyards in the galaxy, third only to the famed shipyards of Corellia and Kuat. The shipyards were overseen by the Fondor Guild of Starship Rights, which doubled as the government of the entire planet. The guild was a member of the Techno Union and remained that way during the Clone Wars, after the Techno Union joined the CIS. Much of the guild didn't really care for the CIS though, and so Fondor ultimately didn't secede, and it provided only token support for the separatist war effort. In practice, it was essentially a neutral world during the Clone Wars, which was ironic given that it was one of the galaxy's leading military shipyards. After leaving the free worlds and entering the Expanse, the Procopia shipping lane proceeded to Procopia, the capital of the Tapani sector. Procopia was a neutral world where inter-house competition was strictly forbidden, the place where the Tapani nobility would come together to make collective decisions. It was an ocean world dotted with lush islands, which, in turn, were covered with settlements packed with luxury resorts. During the summer months, Procopia became the playground of the nobility who would descend on the planet and avail themselves of the planet's luxuries. Procopia had no exports or local industries. Its sole function in the Tapani sector was as a political hub and a luxury resort. All the other worlds of the Expanse were grouped into provinces, subsectors, each ruled by one of the 7 noble houses. Each province had a handful of especially significant worlds, so we're going to go through each of them before moving on to the Tapani sector. Barnaba province, the most rimward of the 7, had its capital on the planet Barnaba, an agricultural world with few centralized settlements, and it also contained the forested resort world Vicinth, the home of the Tapani Arts and Sports Complex, and 4 orbital casinos. Melantha province, the next province over, was one of the largest Tapani sector provinces, but it contained very little of note. A branch of the Procopian shipping lane led through the region, providing safe passage through a series of nebulae, including Shindra's Vale, where the final battle of the Unification War took place. Melantha province's capital was Soterios, an ash-colored arid world dominated by deserts and canyons. Despite its inhospitable nature, Soterios was heavily populated, with 6.7 billion people crammed into sprawling canyon cities. Maseti province, run by the notorious noble house that spawned the Sith-inspired Macrosa Order, was another large subsector. The Procopian shipping lane and a major branch of it, the Leozi route, knit the province's systems together, which contained a number of important worlds. The agri-worlds Tanya and Pella were among the most productive in the Tapani sector, supplying much of the sector's grain and vegetables, while Obulet, the capital of the province, was ringed by productive Ordal shipyards, which were mostly used for repair. Obulet itself was a dim planet orbiting a red dwarf star, heavily urbanized and home to a large population. But the most notorious planet in the Maseti province was Nysa, the birthplace of the Macrosa Order, the site of a battle of the Great Sith War and the target of the cleansing of the Nine Houses. Rena province lay at the end of the Procopia shipping lane, and it was the home of the Expanse's biggest mining conglomerate, Merrick and Kalb Industries. Its only significant world was Rena itself, the subsector capital, the location of the famed Rena University. Bordering the Rena province was Calypso province, which was knit together by the Calypso Run. Calypso province only contained 2 heavily populated systems, with the rest being all rich mining worlds, some of the most significant of which were the moons of the gas giant Corimbus IV, a source of valuable Karuska gems. The capital of Calypso province, Calypso, was also dominated by mining operations, which had rendered its surface almost completely barren, though, unlike the other mining worlds in the province, it also featured large urban areas. Pelagia province, on the coreward end of the Tapani sector, had the fewest mapped systems of any of the 7 provinces. Among its most noteworthy planets were Bethal, a major producer of timber and the headquarters of the Bethal Agricorps, and the subsector capital Pelagon, a warm water world dotted with floating cities. House Pelagia had a close relationship with the Jedi Order, leading to an imperial bombardment of Pelagon during the Great Jedi Purge. Lastly, we have the Kadrian province, which actually controlled a little bit of territory on the Shapani bypass, coreward of the Free Worlds. Kadrian province's main port on the bypass, as well as its sole noteworthy world, was Achilia, a vibrant trade world with a hot climate. There were a few important non-Tapani worlds that lay just past the borders of the Tapani sector. These included the agri-world Silpa, as well as Lamax, an obscure world near one of the Tapani sector nebulae that housed the shadow port, Port Bianco. Just off the shipwright's trace, there was also the Ancient Republic Ordnance/Regional Depot, Enale, the home of the non-sentient Hellas, a species of flying amphibians with natural repulsor lift capabilities. In the modern era, Enale was mostly of interest to biologists studying the Hellas, but during the Pius Dea era, it was the main staging ground for the 11th Crusade, which targeted the Herglics. Past the Tapani sector, the shipwright's trace pushed east into the Rim. If the Shapani bypasses counted as part of the Rimmer, this route intersected all but one of the big 5 hyperspace routes, with intersections on the Rimmer, Corellian Trade Spine, Hidean Way, and Corellian Run. Within the bounds of the southern core, it connected the Tapani sector to the Corellian Trade Spine, which it joined at the Foles Crossroads, as we mentioned earlier. Along the way, the trace passed the minor manufacturing planet Transcell, home to a core galaxy systems manufacturing plant. Besadro, a mining world and flashpoint of the Clone Wars, which likely shipped raw materials up the trace to Fondor, and Tyr in the Surik system, a booming trade world and Clone Wars flashpoint with a prominent tourism sector. Tyr sat at the junction of the shipwright's trace and 2 minor local routes, and was home to the spectacular canyon known as the Tyr Rift, both of which meant that the planet's spaceports were constantly busy. Now to move on to the last part of the southern core, its western end. Much of this part of the southern core was explored a lot later than the rest of it, and most of it was very thinly populated, with only a scattering of obscure colonies across most of the region. Most of the civilization in the western part of the southern core was concentrated along the only major hyperspace route through the region, the Giju Run, which ran from Giju and Herglic space out to the remote Atrician Commonwealth. This route ran along the border between the colonies and the core worlds, and it had its origins in an ancient hyperspace route of the Herglic Trade Empire. The modern Giju Run was blazed by Herglic scouts in 4003 BBY, and since trade along the route was controlled by Giju, the Herglics remained the dominant power throughout the west and southern core through to the time of the Clone Wars. Beyond the Giju Run, there wasn't all that much in this part of the southern core, and in the colonies, much of the western end of the southern core was actually beyond the Republic's borders during the Clone Wars, located in unclaimed space. The Giju Run started in the colonies and remained on that side of the regional border for some time, passing the Omar system before heading into the core. This system contained a number of satellite factories that, under the Empire, came under the total control of CNR Fleet Systems, which used them for the TIE Avenger project. Off the Giju Run itself, there were a number of other noteworthy systems in the angle of space between the Rimmer and Giju Run, the ancient frontier of the Herglic Trade Empire. This included Niel, site of a battle between the judicial forces and local pirates in 35 BBY, Pyros, an ancient ordnance/regional depot just off the Giju Run used as a staging ground for the 11th Pius Dea Crusade, and Dordolom, a minor trade world home to the Bothan-owned Sulferan Shipping Company. A bit further afield, beyond the Republic's borders, was the Xenox star cluster, which contained a small knot of obscure colonies. The Kishoni Nebula was also located in this region, a supernova remnant that formed after the star of the Kishoni system died millennia before the Old Sith Wars. Before its destruction, one of the planets in the Kishoni system was the only source of the rare and extremely valuable Kishoni crystals. In the words of the handmaiden Brianna, these crystals caught the last rays of a dying sun and thus contained extraordinary power which could be unleashed if the crystals were incorporated into a lightsaber. Further west, the Giju Run briefly re-entered the colonies before returning to the core worlds, passing through the Shassos sector as it did so. This sector contained the planet Barzota, which was located directly on the Giju Run, a world of breathtaking mountain formations home to the Bardotans. These were a deeply spiritual people with a strong local Force tradition, and their homeworld was dotted with monasteries and ancient ruins. In ancient days, Bardota was ruled by the warlike Fangral cult, but the Fangral were long ago banished from the planet, replaced by the peaceful, isolationist Dagoyan order. During the Dagoyan period, Bardota became a pleasant, untroubled world ruled by the Baktov Council in conjunction with a monarch. At the time of the Clone Wars, the reigning monarch was Queen Julia, Jar Jar Binks' girlfriend. The Bardotans mostly kept to themselves. They distrusted the Jedi and the Republic by extension, and they neither had any imperial ambitions nor much of an interest in other worlds. But there were a few other nearby worlds with Bardotan settlements, and the Bardotans of those planets had different cultures. The habitable desert moon, Zardosa Styx, which was located close to Bardota, was home to a small Bardotan colony and a series of ziggurats belonging to the survivors of the Frangral cult. After her apparent death in the Battle of Dathomir during the Clone Wars, Mother Talzin took over the Fangral remnants, and the cult attempted to help her regain physical form at one of these monuments. The Bardotans also established a more remote colony at Fu, far beyond the borders of the Republic. The Bardotans of Fu, who called themselves the Fui, dispensed with their original homeworld's religious traditions and built a more modern, urbanized society. Fu became well known across the galaxy for its casinos, despite its remote location, and it achieved even greater fame as the homeworld of legendary pod racer Maz Guo. Just off the Giju Run was Hijaf, the arid homeworld of the Tark, a ruthless and incredibly tough crustacean species. Their tough exoskeletons, incredible strength, and skill at surviving in desert environments despite having originally evolved to live in the sea demonstrate that crustaceans truly are the inevitable endpoint of all evolution. The Tark were not Republic members. On the contrary, they were fiercely isolationist and maintained a large navy and a shell of buffer colonies around Hujaf itself. Other intelligent species from this end of the galaxy included the four-armed Mephitians of Mephitis, a foul-smelling world with a noxious atmosphere, and the tusked, fur-covered Trunsks of Trunska, a cool, rocky world that maintained trade with many of its neighbors. The westernmost depths of the southern core also contained two other curious systems. Candoria, in the Condorian system, a remote planet with a number of colonies, lent its name to the Condorian Plague, a strain of the blue shadow virus that completely depopulated the planet and all its colonies 20 years before the Clone Wars. There was also the Aoa system, an uninhabited system that contained what was believed to have been a celestial construct, the Aoa Diamonds. These were two planets, Aoa 9 and Aoa 10, which were enormous diamonds the size of terrestrial planets, as well as a cloud of diamond fragments that ringed the system out past Aoa 10. Aoa 9 and Aoa 10 were believed to be Chthonian planets, or gas giants that had been stripped down to just their cores, while the diamond cloud might have been the shattered remnants of another Chthonian planet. In the core worlds, the western part of the southern core was still thinly populated and largely a backwater, but it did contain many systems with their own native species, some of which were minor local powers. We know very little about a lot of these, including the thick-skinned Vracolians of Vracolia and the Clodavians of Clodavia, a reptilian species that were immune to mind tricks and that could regenerate limbs, both of whose homeworlds lay not far off the Gidju Run near the Rimmer. The four-armed Cloterians of Cloteria, the Seolans of Seolia, and the pale-skinned Pythons of Python lived a bit closer to the deep core, not far from the borders of the Daupherm planet states. Further out, on the edge of the unknown regions, was the warm jungle world of Raka 4, the homeworld of the web-spinning, hive-minded insectoids known as the Rakans, who transitioned through 5 different sexes over the course of their complex life cycles. Close to Raka 4 were the nebulas of Osork, as well as the Questal sector, which contained the planets of Questal and Nathas 1. Questal was a quite agricultural world near the borders of the Atrician Commonwealth, which it might have supplied food to, while Nathas 1 was an airless rock home to a silicon-based species of shapeshifters known as the Proteans. Proteans weren't very intelligent, but they were quite good at mimicking humanoid forms. One of the most remote regions of the southern core was the Wemel sector, which contained the human colony world Lordovia, one of several human settlements in the Wemel sector. Lordovia was the site of the infamous Battle of Lordovia during the Clone Wars, during which General Grievous ordered the release of an airborne strain of brain rot plague on the planet. This particular strain, which became known as the Lordovian brain rot plague, wiped out the planet's garrison of clone troopers as well as the rest of Lordovia's entire population. And it didn't stop there. Before Republic forces were able to intervene, the disease began spreading all across the sector. The Republic was forced to quarantine the entire Wemel sector, and every single human within the sector's borders, including many clone troopers and many more civilians, died of the disease. Moving on from War Crime Land, let's return to the Gidju Run. This route entered the core worlds at the Elodia sector, a proud, semi-independent region that contained the planet Elodia and 20 of its colonies. The Elodia sector was the largest population center on the Gidju Run, and its people, the Elodians, were humans with a distinct culture. Elodia, the capital of the sector, was quite wealthy and it had a renowned military tradition, which made the Elodia sector's planetary security force one of the best in the region. Officers in this military were trained at the Elodian Officers Academy on Elodia itself. The Elodia sector was ruled by an ancient oligarchy which was based on Elodia. Further down the Gidju Run was Dartag, more commonly known as Necropolis, as it was a tomb world used for mass burials by the core worlds. Necropolis was shrouded in perpetual mist, and most of its surface was covered by vast graveyards. Despite the inherent creepiness of such a planet, there were actually people living on Necropolis, a multi-species mix known as the Necropolitans. These guys maintained a few small spaceports, and they also acted as caretakers for the graveyards, ensuring that even the anonymous corpses dropped on the planet by the other core worlds were treated with at least some modicum of respect. Near the Diatag system, just off the Giju run, were Protobranch, the home of the Ricarda-like Bivals, Inish, a lush world rich in Kalonterium ore that was home to the thin, reptilian Abenishi, and Ord Saboak, an ancient Republic military staging ground. Ord Saboak was founded for the 11th Pius Dea Crusade, but it remained inhabited in modern times, home to a number of high-class casinos and clubs which were frequented by military personnel. And with those worlds out of the way, all that remains is the last and most legendary of the Southern Core's allied regions, the Atrician Commonwealth. With its capital on Atricia, sometimes known as Kitel Fard, at the end of the Giju run, this ancient and enigmatic civilization was insular but remote, located on the very edge of the unknown regions. The Atrician Commonwealth had territory in both the core worlds and the colonies, though all the noteworthy systems were in the core, and it contained a total of 200 settled worlds. This was an isolationist, rarely visited region that nonetheless had a vice grip on the public imagination, as described by Dr. Milanda Vorgan in her article, The Written Word, a brief introduction to the writing systems of Galactic Basic. To quote, "Most people associate the Atrician Empire with exotic danger. The brutal conquests of its early rulers, the brilliant but ruthless political gambits of Emperor Weg Qing, the distilled political craftiness of his sayings, or the sociopathic decadence of the 6 savage viziers. For millennia, Atrician writings, including the aforementioned sayings of Weg Qing, were heavily studied by politicians and generals alike, renowned for their insights into topics as diverse as warfare, diplomacy, and governance. The Atrician Commonwealth was run by the Atricians, a human culture descended from ancient settlers who had first come to Atricia in ancient times. It isn't known exactly when Atrician culture got started, but rumors of the civilization were around back during the First Great Schism, so at the absolute latest, Atricia would have to have been settled circa 25,000 BBY. It's possible that humans were seeded on Atricia by the Celestials or Rakata, especially given that sources indicate that when recorded Atrician history began, the Atricians didn't have space travel technology. Atricia, the capital of the Atrician Commonwealth, was a diverse, terrestrial world with multiple continents, and in the early days of Atrician civilization, it was divided between a multitude of nations, which fought each other in a series of brutal wars. These conflicts ended when the whole of Atricia was united under the rule of the Kitel Fard dynasty, the rulers of the Atrician Empire. This took an excruciatingly long time. It wasn't until the reign of the 54th emperor of the Kitel Fard dynasty, Weg Qing, that the whole of Atricia was fully united at last. He accomplished this not just through open warfare, but also through deception, espionage, assassinations, and diplomacy. Remembered as a crafty statesman and unenlightened despot, Weg Qing ruled over the Atrician Empire with an iron fist, but he also ushered in an unprecedented age of order and stability for the planet. For the latter reason, he was usually remembered as an ancient hero by Atricians of later generations, who often referred to Atricia as Kitel Fard in honor of the dynasty that had united it. Over the course of his long reign, Weg Qing crushed 30 rebellions and left a long list of instructions to future emperors, his revered sayings, the advice in which often bordered on what we might call Machiavellian. Nonetheless, the sayings were widely read, and they were considered part of the ideological basis of the Galactic Empire. The Atrician Empire soon developed space travel technology and expanded to other worlds in other star systems, carving out a small region of space for itself in a series of brutal conquests. The armies of the Atrician Empire became renowned for the discipline of their warriors, and some aspects of Atrician culture soon spread even to the distant territories of the Galactic Republic. Most prominently, this included a fighting technique and a kind of paired katanas developed by the Yovshin swordsmen, both known as Jar Kai, after the Atrician capital city where they were developed. The art of Jar Kai would eventually be picked up by the Jedi Order, which developed it into a lightsaber fighting style. For millennia, the Etruscan Empire was only a distant rumour to the Republic as it lay on the far side of the Herglic trade empire. It was only at some point between 5000 and 4000 BBY, long after the Republic absorbed the Herglic trade empire, that it made first contact with the Etruscan Empire. Shortly thereafter, the Herglics established the Geetsly Run to link the remote territory to the rest of galactic civilization, and the Etruscan Empire was opened up to the galaxy at last. This is what prompted the wave of exploration and settlement that opened up the western parts of the southern core. In the millennia that followed, the Etruscan Empire entered a state of decline, leading to the Etruscan Parliament seizing power in around 600 BBY. Under the Parliament, the Etruscan Empire became the Etruscan Commonwealth, a largely democratic society, though it still kept the Emperor around as a figurehead. By the time of the Clone Wars, the Etruscan Commonwealth was generally regarded as a mostly mundane region with a lot of fascinating history, which the Etruscan people still recalled with pride. Apart from Etrusia itself, the worlds of the Commonwealth included Kilea, the namesake of the archaic Chilean bolt guns used by the Etruscan nobility, and Frisial, a nature preserve that the Galactic Empire would later claim as a retreat for wealthy imperial families. All told, the Etruscan Commonwealth was mostly just another relic of an ancient empire, like many other regions in the southern core, if a particularly fascinating one. At the start of the Clone Wars, the southern core was one of the few regions of the galaxy with no separatist enclaves at all. All of the region was either under Republic control or unclaimed space. But the fires of war still made their way to the southern core, and for one simple reason. While there were no separatist enclaves in the region itself, one of the most militarized parts of separatist space was located just beyond its edge. Just past the Foles crossroads, the Corellian trade spine plunged into separatist territory right as it entered the inner rim, and the same was true for the Rimmer trade route, which was under firm separatist control from Thyfera onwards. These two hyperspace routes defined the Clone Wars in what Republic strategists called the Yagdul Theater, which included the southern core. The parts of the Corellian trade spine that were under Republic control were a major supply line for the Republic military and a key invasion corridor into separatist space, as well as a potential invasion corridor for separatist fleets attempting to attack the Arrowhead. The Rimmer trade route, meanwhile, was almost entirely under separatist control in the early years of the war, partly due to the Trade Federation's monopoly on shipping along the route. With the exception of a small enclave around Eriadu, the southern core portion of the Rimmer was the only stretch of the route the Republic had any presence on. As a result, for the Republic, it was absolutely imperative to maintain control of the southern core portions of these two routes, while for the Confederacy, securing the entire length of the Rimmer and the trade spine were some of its most important military objectives. Consequently, the southern core saw heavy fighting throughout the Clone Wars, though this was mostly concentrated along these two routes. The Republic divided the southern core between two of its sector armies. The second sector army, or Green Mantle Command, was responsible for defending the inner Corellian trade spine and the surrounding systems, alongside other duties in other regions. Green Mantle's headquarters was at Nubia and the Arrowhead, but it maintained Duro as one of its most important fortress worlds. Most of the action the Second Army saw during the Clone Wars happened in the southern core during the battle for control of the trade spine. The rest of the southern core was all under the control of the 20th Sector Army, or Emerald Banner Command, the last of the sector armies. Emerald Banner was tasked with defending the southern core and securing the upper Rimmer against constant separatist onslaughts, one of the most challenging missions any of the sector armies was assigned. Emerald Banner was headquartered at Talan in the Tapani sector, which became a key Republic military stronghold, preventing the separatists from gaining any ground on the Shapani bypass. As we mentioned earlier, the separatists had no permanent territory in the southern core, but they did have some influence on a few worlds. They established a temporary presence on Deveron at a few points, and they had collaborators producing war material for them on Belgoroth and Fondor, though not in great quantities. In the early war, they also took Besadro and held it for a time, using it as a mining world. For the most part though, these were all minor holdings. Most of the fighting in the southern core happened along the Rimmer trade route. The Confederacy was on the offensive up the Rimmer for nearly the entire war, keeping the 20th Army constantly on the back foot. Early in the war, Separatist forces advanced up the Rimmer as far as Giju, where Republic forces had to fight a fierce and extraordinarily bloody battle to keep the Separatists from overrunning Herglic space. The Battle of Giju ultimately saw a small Republic force train and lead a local militia to victory, stopping the Separatist encroachment, but at an enormous cost in lives. Several other bloody early war battles happened along the shipwright's trace, which the Separatists also attacked in the hope of using it to take the Rimmer. These included the Battle of Thiers, another Pyrrhic high-casualty Republic victory, as well as the Battle of Basadro. On paper, Basadro was a Republic victory, but it ended up becoming a major PR disaster after the CIS shadow feed widely broadcast evidence of a war crime that Republic forces committed during the siege. The Southern Corps was also the stage on which another early war drama was set, the first attacks of the Separatist flagship, Malevolence. This titanic vessel first struck in the Battle of Fu, in which it annihilated a Republic task force without leaving a single survivor. It continued this pattern in attacks on the 20th Army fleet groups all across the Southern Corps, until the nature of the ship was finally revealed after the Battle of Abrogado. The Malevolence's campaign was mostly a series of terror attacks with little direct strategic value, but it did significantly strain the resources of Emerald Banner Command, forcing it to waste resources hunting the mystery ship while the Confederacy attained the upper hand on the Rimmer. Initially, the war on the Corellian trade spine was much less brutal, though there were a number of early battles on Deveron. Early in the war, a corrupt Deveronian senator allowed the planet to be used as a base for Separatist privateers, harassing Republic shipping on the trade spine, and the Confederacy later attacked Deveron in 2 battles in 21 BBY. The first attack failed, but the second captured the crucial Temple of Edict. Not long after, in early 20 BBY, General Grievous began a major offensive aimed at capturing the entire Corellian trade spine, known as Operation Dirge's Lance. In the Southern Corps, Operation Dirge's Lance steadily advanced up the spine, while other Separatist forces took the rimward portion of the route. During this advance, the Republic fought a brutal battle at Pharos, before ultimately being crushed in the Battle of Duro, the greatest Separatist victory of the war, in which General Grievous took the most vital Republic stronghold in the Southern Corps. For a short time after the Battle of Duro, the CIS had complete control of the entire Corellian trade spine, and Grievous used Duro as a staging ground for terror attacks across the core worlds. Operation Dirge's Lance ultimately saw Grievous capture a total of 26 core worlds, and while many of these were in the Arrowhead, others were in the Southern Core. Grievous advanced all the way across the Southern Core to Lordovia, where the general unleashed the Brainrot Plague and depopulated the entire Wemel sector. But the Confederacy's offensives in the Southern Core didn't last. Later in 20 BBY, the Republic retook Duro and the upper trade spine, mostly reversing Grievous's earlier gains. New Plympto, a Separatist world in the Corellian sector, remained under Separatist control, but apart from that, by the end of 20 BBY, the CIS had been driven back into the Inner Rim in the Yagdul Theatre. During the Outer Rim sieges, New Plympto was besieged, and Republic forces advanced down the trade spine and Rimmer towards Separatist space. They didn't make any progress, however, until the last days of the war, when General Grievous stripped the Yagdul Theatre of assets to assemble a fleet to attack Coruscant. As Separatist resistance suddenly collapsed, 2nd and 20th Army forces poured south toward Yagdul, but even as they did, Grievous secretly led one last armada through the Southern Core into the Deep Core and ultimately to the Galactic capital itself. So, that brings us to the end of our tour of the Southern Core. We hope you've enjoyed this exhaustively thorough look at this fascinating tract of space. But what do you think? Do you like these sorts of videos? Which of the planets or peoples of the Southern Core do you find the most interesting? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.